Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Peter Muhlenberg. Peter Muhlenberg was from a German part of eastern Pennsylvania, and as such, he went to Europe to study because he was from a fairly wealthy family. However, at the time, most wealthy families went to somewhere in Great Britain, usually London, but maybe Edinburgh or something of that nature. Peter Muhlenberg is one of the few founders who was sent from colonial America to Germany to study, and this he did. And then he returned, and instead of returning to Pennsylvania, he moved to Virginia, where he became a Lutheran minister. And he served here for several years and eventually joined politics and was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, which again is the name of their colonial assembly. Now, after a little bit in the House of Burgesses, becoming friends with George Washington and Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, Muhlenberg was moved to the Patriot cause. And when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he actually leaves the ministry and signs up to fight in the war. He is chosen as a colonel in the Continental Army, and he spends almost the entirety of the war with the Continental Army. He serves bravely in the New York, New Jersey campaigns earlier in the war, but eventually George Washington sends Muhlenberg to Virginia to secure the defenses of the state of Virginia. And he's in this position when the famous Battle of Yorktown breaks out, the victory at Yorktown, and Muhlenberg does serve under Lafayette at that victory. Now, after the war ends, Muhlenberg decides to return to his native land of Pennsylvania, and he goes back to Pennsylvania, and while there, he actually ends up very quickly being elected vice president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Council. And the Supreme Council, Pennsylvania did some weird stuff in those first few years, but suffice to say, he was essentially acting as lieutenant governor of the state of Pennsylvania. And he's in this position until after the United States Constitution is passed, at which point Pennsylvania elects Muhlenberg to the United States House of Representatives, where Muhlenberg becomes an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. He'd actually served 2 terms, though they were non-consecutive in the House, and during this time, he starts a society, and that's why I have him listed next to me as Democratic Societies, because he started what is sometimes called democratic, but often in hindsight called Democratic Republican societies, though that's not what they called themselves. He started a Democratic Republican society, and the idea was to talk about politics, and it essentially became the first party machine. Now, they became associated with the anti-administration at first, and then later Jeffersonian Democrats, or Jeffersonian Republicans. But at this point, George Washington didn't necessarily love what Muhlenberg and his societies were doing, mostly because they became associated with Citizen Genet, the representative from France who came to the United States and started trying to recruit Americans to fight in the French Revolution. And additionally, he became associated with several other causes that were basically against the Americans. For example, the Whiskey Rebellion is something that Muhlenberg and his associates were considered soft on, and George Washington actually spoke publicly against these societies, mostly because he didn't like them being associated with things he was doing wrong, but also because George Washington was very much against faction, or what we would call political parties. And these did turn into political parties. After Washington spoke out, the Democratic societies did fizzle away for the most part, but some of them, and one very notable one, stuck around because up in New York, Aaron Burr had started a Democratic Society, and that quickly became known as the Tammany Society. And the Tammany Society, very not too long later, became known as Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall would dominate New York state politics for a century almost. And a lot of that can be related back to Peter Muhlenberg. Now, Muhlenberg, after his starting these parties and his time in Congress, he's actually elected to the United States Senate, appointed at this time, and were appointed to the Senate. He's appointed to the United States Senate. He goes for a special election, but only stays for about 2 months and then goes back home. This is part of the wave of Democratic Republicans that took over when Thomas Jefferson became president, and Muhlenberg, associated with Jefferson, was part of that rise. But once he leaves, he wants a job because he hasn't been a minister in quite some time. He's been in politics at this point for about 25 years. And he reaches out to his old buddy Thomas Jefferson. And President Jefferson appoints him as customs collector for the port of Philadelphia. And at the same time, he gets the job through the state of Pennsylvania as revenue collector for the state. So he is in charge of collecting and overseeing quite a bit of money coming into the state of Pennsylvania, and at that point still extremely important and one of the most profitable ports in the young nation of Philadelphia. So this is an extremely brief overview of the life of Peter Muhlenberg. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, definitely hit like. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about different American founders every single day with lots of additional content. Trivia on Fridays, wrap up on Thursdays, lots of interviews coming up with different authors and people involved with studying the American Revolution. So if that's your kind of thing, thank you for coming, and definitely hit subscribe. I will be back with another founder for you tomorrow.